Donald Byrne, Bobby Fischer. The game started out with the Grunfeld defense. Knight f3. Knight f6. c4. g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Fischer's plan is to allow white to establish a stronghold in the center, for black to undermine with its fianchetto bishop leading the charge. After d4, black could play d5, reaching the Grunfeld defense immediately. However, Fischer castled. If Byrne continued with e4, following d6, bishop e2, e5, is the main line of the king's Indian defense. But white played bishop f4, and black continued with d5, transposing the game to the Grunfeld defense, which usually runs d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and here, the Grunfeld defense is characterized with what move? d5. Now back to the game. White continued with queen b3, a form of the Russian system, right? Its usual move order from here continues d5, knight f3, bishop g7, queen b3, putting pressure on Fischer's central d5 pawn. Now back to the game. After d takes c4, Fischer gives white the center, as planned. Queen takes c4, and now black's plan is to undermine white's stronghold. But how? How should black play? First, black needs to defend against a few things with what move? c6. Also possible is knight a6, the prince variation, preparing c5, to challenge white's center. After c6, continued e4. Here, how should black carry out its plan to undermine white's center? In later games, black played b5, followed by queen a5. Fischer continued developing with knight b d7, a quiet, unassuming development move but with purpose and a destination. After rook d1, black's knight's purpose becomes clear with knight b6, continued developing with a tempo-gaining strike against white's exposed queen. So how should white play? Queen c5 is highly risky, as it leaves the queen exposed. For example, with knight a4, or knight e4, as Fischer brilliantly demonstrates. Though both of those squares are protected by white's c3 knight, he understandably did not appreciate the danger. Here, queen b3 would have left the queen better placed, although it would have invited further harassment. So after queen c5, black's best try is with bishop g4. Byrne's pawns control the center squares. However, Fischer is ahead in piece development and has castled, while Byrne's king is still in the center. These factors would not have been very significant had Byrne attended to his development on his next move. How should white play? Bishop e2. Or bishop g5. Not bishop g5. Bad move. Wrong strategy, wanting to prevent knight fd7. Followed by e5. But Byrne errs by not completing his development. Here, numerous authors suggest bishop e2, protecting the king and preparing kingside castling. The game, Fleer, Morris, Dublin 1991, continued knight fd7. Queen a3. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. e5. d takes e5. Queen e8. Bishop e2. Knight takes e5. Castle. And white was slightly better. Back to the game, after bishop g5. Bobby Fischer makes, according to Jonathan Rowson, one of the most powerful moves of all time, with what move? Knight a4. That's it. A very strong move. Fischer offers an ingenious knight sacrifice. So how should white continue? Should white take the knight? If Byrne played knight takes a4, Fischer would reply, with what move? Knight takes e4, leaving Byrne with some terrible choices. Question, how should white play? Queen takes e7, as queen a5. b4. Queen takes a4. Queen takes e4. Rook fe8. Bishop e7. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Bishop f8. Produces a deadly pin. And with bishop takes e7. Following knight takes c5. Bishop takes d8. Knight takes a4. Bishop g5. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Knight takes b2. Gives Fischer an extra pawn and ruins Byrne's pawn structure. Also with queen c1. After queen a5. Knight c3. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Knight takes g5. Regains the sacrificed piece with a better position and an extra pawn. And finally, queen b4. As knight takes g5. Knight takes g5. Bishop takes d1. King takes d1. Bishop takes d4. Queen d2. Bishop takes f2. With a winning material advantage, says Fischer. Instead of knight takes a4, white continued with queen a3. And following knight takes c3. B takes c3. How should black play? Knight takes e4. Yeah. Good move. Offering material in order to open the e-file and get at white's king. Bishop takes e7. Queen b6. Bishop takes f8. Bishop takes f8. Queen b3. Fischer analyzes. Knight takes c3. Yeah. Good move. As queen takes c3. Whoa, that's a blunder. Because black can win the queen, with what move? Bishop b4. Also after queen takes b6. Following it takes b6. Rook a1. Rook e8. King d2. Knight e4. King c2. Knight takes f2. Rook g1. And here, black has bishop f5. Which is winning for black. Also strong is rook e8. If white continues with bishop e2. White has knight takes c3. Yeah. Good move. And if white continues with queen takes b6. Following it takes b6. Bishop e2. Knight takes c3. Rook d2. Bishop b4. King f1. Knight e4. Rook b2. Bishop c3. Rook c2. Knight d2. King g1. Rook takes e2. Rook takes c3. Knight takes f3. G takes f3. Bishop h3. Rook c1. Rook takes a2. White is left absolutely paralyzed. And here, instead of king g1, with knight takes d2. Following bishop takes e2. King g1. Bishop d3. Rook c1. Bishop takes d2. Leaves black with a winning material advantage. So white continued with bishop c4. Knight takes c3. Now both queen takes c3. Rook fe8. And bishop takes f8. Bishop takes f8. Are both good for black. After bishop c5. Rook fe8. King f1. Here, how should black play? Instead of protecting his queen, Fischer launches a stunning counterattack. With what move? Bishop e6. This stunning stratagem is the move that made this game famous. As knight b5. Bad move. Losing to, with what move? Bishop takes f7. As follows: king takes f7. Queen b3. Bishop e6. Knight g5. King g8. Knight takes e6. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Queen takes b3. Knight takes b3. And white's happy. King f1. Bishop e6. Here, white played bishop takes b6. Bad move. The move, bishop takes e6, would have been even worse, leading to a smothered mate with queen b5. King g1. Knight e2. King f1. Knight g3. King g1. Queen f1. Rook takes f1. With mate to follow. Right? In 1. If white continued with queen takes c3, black has what move? Queen takes c5. Yeah. Good move. And if d takes c5, bishop takes c3, black should win the endgame. White's best chance may have been bishop d3. However, black has what move? Knight b5. Yeah. Good move. Winning for black in the long run, according to Kmoch. Burn takes the offered queen. Bishop takes b6, hoping to outplay his 13-year-old opponent in the ensuing complications. However, Fischer gets far too much for his queen, leaving Burn with a hopeless game. Bishop takes c4. Fischer now begins a windmill series of discovered checks, picking up material. King g1. Knight e2. King f1. Knight takes d4. How should white play? Rook d3. Or king g1. Not. Rook d3. Takes b6. Queen c3. Knight takes f3. Queen takes c4. With mate to follow. Right? In 1. The game continued with king g1. Knight e2. King f1. Knight c3. King g1. Takes b6. Fischer captures a piece, simultaneously attacking Burn's queen. Queen b4. Here, how should black continue? Knight takes d1. Or rook a4. Not knight takes d1. Bad move. Because white has what move? Queen takes c4. Which is much less clear. Otherwise, it is hard to explain why Burn played bishop takes b6, since black now has a clear win. After rook a4, Fischer's pieces cooperate nicely. The bishop on g7 protects the knight on c3, which protects the rook on a4, which in turn protects the bishop on c4, and forces Burn's queen away. Trying to protect his rook with queen d6, loses the queen, with what move? Knight takes d1. And after queen takes d1, rook takes a2. What is black threatening? Rook a1. Queen takes b6. And after knight takes d1, Fischer has more than enough material for his sacrificed queen, a rook, 2 bishops, and a pawn, leaving him ahead the equivalent, roughly, of 1 minor piece, an easy win. Black's pieces dominate the board and Burn's remaining rook is stuck on h1. Burn could resign here, but plays on until checkmate. The game continued with h3. Rook takes a2. King h2. Knight takes f2. Rook e1. Rook takes e1. Queen d8. Bishop f8. Knight takes e1. Bishop d5. Knight f3. Knight e4. Queen b8. b5. Note how white's queen can do nothing against black's well-coordinated pieces. After h4. h5. Knight e5. King g7. Fischer breaks the pin, allowing the bishop to attack as well. King g1. Bishop c5. Now Fischer smokes out the white king from its last defender. King f1. Knight g3. King e1. Bishop b4. King d1. Bishop b3. King c1. Knight e2. King b1. With mate to follow. Right? In 2. With knight c3. King c1. Last question, how many moves delivers mate in 1? 2 moves. Bishop a3. And rook c2. The end.